She led a 10-year, over $200 million viral emergence early warning project named PREDICT, which was developed with the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threats Program. Currently, she is the director of USAID's One Health Workforce Next Generation Project, which aims to build global One Health human resource capacity in Asia and Africa. Dr. Mazet was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Medicine in 2013 in recognition of her successful and innovative approach to emerging environmental and global health threats. Oop, my sheet disappeared, sorry. And serves on the National Academy's Forum of Microbial Threats, as well as chairs the Academy's One Health Action Collaborative. Additionally, Dr. Mazet has mentored 2 GloCal Fellows, and she has been serving on our GloCal Steering Committee since the beginning of our program in 2012. So we're very excited to hear from Dr. Mazet today. Welcome, Dr. Mazet.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. I just have here, oopsie, sorry. I don't know how to make you guys go right there. Sorry. We'll zoom you there for a second. I wanted to just highlight some of the topics that Kimberly and Lucia asked me to cover. So we're gonna kind of move through these very quickly, and I can go through this introductory slide on my background very quickly because Kimberly just covered it. And thank you for that. One thing I do want to touch on, and I think it was one of the reasons the team asked me to speak to you, is just talk to you a little bit about One Health and its role in global health. So One Health is a term we use that is fairly recent, and it's really caught energy and enthusiasm over the last decade or so, but it is an ancient concept, and it's been around since the time of Hippocrates, and we've been using it at my university without really knowing or calling it One Health since the 1960s. So that probably colors some of my background and perspectives on the way I approach global health problem solving, in that I've always been taught or brought up academically as an epidemiologist, thinking about the interactions of animals and humans and the influence of environmental factors and things like food and nutrition, which require healthy plants and ecosystems. This past year, finally, I think we've converged, the community, the One Health community has converged on a nice definition. I really like it. It's one that's very similar to what I've used while everyone was arguing about what the definition of One Health should be. And I've listed it for you here. I'm not going to read it to you, but the big change is that the plants have been called out separately. So it is the intersection, working at that intersection and considering the interactions of human, animal, environmental, and plant health. And I think sometimes things like wildlife and plants get sort of bundled into the environment, and it wasn't really working. We weren't getting all of the right sectors at the table. So the definition has changed a little bit. This is how we like to think about it at UC Davis, and now at UC San Francisco, where I'm also affiliated with the Institute for Global Health Sciences. I sometimes shorten that definition a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that that you all sort of picked up on what I consider the 2 key elements of One Health, and that is the collaborative nature. So really working across disciplines is key. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for the One Health workforce, for employers, for you as you're becoming more and more leaders in this field and educators of the next generation. And then the other key tenet is that intersection that we've already covered, thinking about health for people's, animals, plants, and our environment. So when we think about these things, you can see on the right-hand side of your screen some of the problems that are typically approached using this One Health paradigm. I'm going to certainly talk to you a little bit more about zoonotic disease emergence, or those pathogens that can be transmitted between people and animals. But certainly all of the other things listed here and many, many more can benefit from that collaborative interdisciplinary approach. Um, and when we're doing that, though, we can't forget to think about the underlying drivers. So one of the key parts of One Health is really getting to the foundation of the problem, rather than just treating the problem and trying to, basically, if we make a metaphor of the problem needing to, have some medicine, really we want to do the preventive medicine. And to do that, we have to get to the drivers and the influences that create these problems and that facilitate these problems in the first place. I do work on the zoonotic disease side, and as I think many of you know, probably all of you know, the public is really interested in these diseases, but only in the last 15 years or so. Before that, people didn't even really think about, and often people in medical schools weren't taught anymore about zoonotic diseases. It was a problem that many felt had sort of come and gone and that we had a handle on. And certainly that's not the case. And in many low resource settings, the communities living with zoonotic disease hadn't forgotten or lost sight of that, because they managed their daily lives and their livelihoods around this sort of limit of transmission. Now, you heard a little bit from Kimberly that I do have a background in wildlife. I'm a veterinarian, and then I did a master's in preventive veterinary medicine, which is similar to an MPH, but you have to already have a professional or graduate degree to be able to do it. And then I did a PhD in epidemiology, and as I mentioned, that was cross-trained with for humans and for animals. Or any other sectors, really, but the focus was really on humans and animals. I tended to look at it and use that from a wildlife conservation perspective. And somewhat interestingly, my career path twisted and turned to come around to emerging infectious diseases, because I was really looking at problems in conservation dependent or endangered species that were really often the drivers of those were human behavior and what we were doing to landscapes and how we were managing the systems where we live intensively. That brought me around to also realize that wildlife were sentinels for things that were coming and affecting our populations, especially vulnerable populations, maybe compromised by HIV/AIDS and other systems. So really what I was finding was that the wildlife I was trying to save were also giving me clues about saving people and human populations. The majority of emerging infectious diseases of people are from animals. That's not too surprising, because we can be the naive population, and when we interact with animals that we haven't sort of intimately interacted with in our environmental history, ecological history, we can receive and be infected and be susceptible sometimes to diseases caused by those organisms that might not be pathogenic to the native host, but could be to us as a vulnerable, naive population. Most animal or zoonotic diseases do come from wildlife for the same reason. We are changing the way we interact with wildlife, and we're sort of taking over the planet more and more, and taking over more pristine habitats more and more. So our activities at these interfaces that sort of put ecosystems out of balance are what have been linked to most of those spillover events and epidemics like Nipah, SARS, Ebola, and other things. And the big concern is that we are noticing and recognizing on the order of about 3 new infectious diseases in people each year. So it kind of behooves us to get a handle on the drivers, the underlying influences, and what we're going to do about this ongoing emergence and even acceleration of emergence. So as mentioned again by Kimberly, about 10 years ago, a team of scientists and public health professionals and social scientists got together to respond to the US Agency for International Development's call to preempt or combat at the source the first stages of emergence of zoonotic diseases. And that was really a heavy call. Of sort of how do you stop things before you even know what they are. But we decided to jump in anyway. And the goal really from USAID's perspective was to stop pandemics. That's really a big challenge, and we hope to be just working around the edges to slowly reduce the risk and help especially communities most at risk to start to manage their own behaviors and reduce their risk while also looking at the big picture globally. And we do that using this One Health approach, as I mentioned, and we want to get ahead of the game. This is the consortium that we put together from the global perspective. So a lot of great organizations on the US side bidding from the USAID funding perspective, but we also work with USAID, the missions in the countries where we work, and the ministries of health, agriculture, and environment, and university and NGO partners, some of the organizations and institutions that you all are affiliated, because I had the chance to look at your bios. And we've been doing that in about 35 countries. Here's kind of what I was talking about. In the green, you can see that viruses can be circulating in wildlife, sometimes spilling over from one wild species to another, sometimes making those species sick. But we tend to notice it when it spills over into domestic animals, affecting our food supply, and into people, sometimes after being amplified in the domestic animals, like we believe the cycle to be working in MERS, for example. Our idea is that if we knew more about what was out there circulating, we could be more ready for it and start to mitigate behaviors. We could also have better laboratory systems so that we could have early detection and identification at the source of these infectious agents, so that we have much, much better opportunity for quicker control, and we can lower those epidemic curves. So how do we do that? Well, we get out there and start looking. This is kind of what I call the flu of death slide, where it gives you a illustration of the kinds of interfaces where people are living right. The pigs basically are kind of looking into the front door of the family's home here. And that not only do we have the chickens and the pigs and the people intermixing and sharing things like influenza viruses, but also we have rodents, shrews, bats, all sorts of other creatures, ducks, things that can come in and out. So we worked with the best literature we could find. We scoured the literature for years, actually, working on probabilistic models, and then used that information, which was sparse, to get out into the field and collect the samples necessary to start to make some inferences about what we can do, what we should do to mitigate pandemics and improve and reduce our risks for epidemics. So getting those samples was one. The communities themselves becoming the early warning system and letting us know when things were going on so that we could respond with them to possible epidemics and hopefully stop those outbreaks at their source. Then get those samples into the laboratory, identify what was going on while training and making sure that we had laboratory capacities and platforms that could be mobilized and used in the lowest resource settings. That was a huge challenge. And then that data has to come back and get into the probabilistic models to make them even better. So we worked at a lot of high-risk interfaces like this one. I mentioned MERS, so we're interested in not only what you can see here, but also especially those bats, those rodents, other creatures that aren't always what we see, but that we live with intimately. They adapt very well, including primates. And here's this gentleman making pizza in Senegal. And I think many of you know, either from your travels or from where you live, that there are certain wildlife species that adapt to us very well and end up sharing things like our houses and our food even sometimes. So here's what we really did. We did that early recognition. We sampled the wildlife, but we also did syndromic surveillance in people working and living in close contact at these high-risk interfaces with the wildlife. And not only did we sample people with fevers of unknown origin that met encephalitis and respiratory disease case definitions, but we also sampled people that were apparently healthy but had high occupational risk. And see, this is some of the occupational risk that I mentioned. This is bat guano farming in Southeast Asia. And the bats are really, really important to our systems. They're pollinators, seed dispersers like these fruit bats, and they help to control pests in many communities, but they're also food and people. These are bats in a market, and we prefer people didn't eat bats, but if they're going to eat bats, we also want it to be safe. We had to do a lot of development of sampling technologies and critical assessment, and we worked with zoos and populations to get the best, most accurate techniques developed. And then, as I mentioned, get into the laboratory, working across cultures, but also building this amazing workforce that I'm so happy to be affiliated with. Oh. There we go. So the outcomes are that we were able to participate in the training of over 6,000 individuals in the One Health paradigm, including in the laboratory, in the field, biosecurity, biosafety. We strengthened the capacity of laboratories doing viral detection and discovery, more than 60 laboratories in Southeast Asia and Africa primarily, but some in Latin America as well, and South Asia. And we took many, many samples, over 163,000 samples, actually 163,000 individuals, and each of those had many samples taken. And we identified about more than 1,000 viruses. About 20% of those were known. So using our platform that we were able to operationalize, we were picking up known viruses that perhaps had never been recognized in certain species or regions before, as well as novel viruses in viral families that have known to spill over and cause disease. And so when we were doing that, we were working very closely with the communities, as I mentioned, and able to develop tools for communities to use to reduce their risk, as well as for the scientific community, like this spillover viral risk ranking, to start to understand and prioritize the viruses that were being found. We also identified problems in the academic community, problems in the public health community. For example, we identified a new Ebola virus called Bumbly Ebola virus in Sierra Leone. We identified Marburg virus, not known to have been in West Africa, also in Sierra Leone. And we also identified Ebola Zaire, or the cause of the West Africa Ebola outbreak in people in bats that weren't being really studied for Ebola, the microbats in Liberia. But sometimes we get into an issue where we wonder, should we publish first, or should we get this information out to the public and the communities at risk first? I feel strongly that we need to do the former, and the left-hand side of your screen, get it out into the public. But there is an issue with quality, whether or not we've been through peer review and we have the academic community's stamp of approval of what we're finding is real. We don't want to raise false alarms. That said, the publication process that can take up to a year can be really difficult to manage, and I don't think we should let communities stay at risk when we have that information. Okay, so just moving through, where does that take us next? What should we do next? Well, one of the things is this project lets us know that it is within our capacity to know what we haven't known in the past, to know and understand viruses the way we do for bacteria. And if we use what we've been able to find with this huge project, as I mentioned, sampling over 160,000 individuals, wildlife and people primarily, we can start to estimate with good math that there are probably about 500 million viruses out there that are able to infect people that we don't know about yet, because we've only been studying the very few that rise to a level of interest because they're making people sick right now. The problem is that that means that we're chasing the last virus instead of being ready for the next one. And that has proven to be very dangerous and very expensive in lives lost, as well as in dollars spent. Because every time we have a large epidemic, it costs the world, the global community, around the order of $40 billion US to respond. And for just less than a tenth of that, we could actually know almost all of the virus that's out there. And for even 5% of that, we could know about 90% of the viruses that are out there. And what is the added really strong benefit of doing a project like we're calling the Global Virome Project, or an initiative to work together across the globe to really find these viruses, is that while you're doing that, you're strengthening the capacities of the laboratories to detect these viruses, so that if they do have a spillover event and when they do have outbreaks, they're better prepared to detect and diagnose the problem that they're having. Now, on the One Health workforce side, of course, when I talk about strengthening capacities, many of us on this webinar are planning on or already are educators, and we want this strong workforce. And I'm really pleased that the U.S. Agency for International Development in this same realm has committed to being able to strengthen this network of universities across Southeast Asia and Africa to really do the best training possible. And I believe that SIAHUN, the Southeast Asia One Health Network, and University Network, as well as the OShea, or the One Health Network, University Network in Africa, which may be changing its name to AfriHUN, kind of in the SIAHUN realm. I believe those networks can be the models for the world of how to do One Health training and workforce building the best that it can be done. In order to help support them, we've been able to do a huge survey, and I have given you in your PDF from Lucia earlier more details on this. We're not going to spend a bunch of time, but I thought that it would be worthwhile for you all to just recognize the skill sets that employers are looking for. And number 3 there, of course, we're studying and working on our scientific strengthening to identify these principles that influence complex challenges in health, and etiology, evolution, and ecology of infectious disease agents, number 4. But the employers really list at the top of their desires the interpersonal communication and the ability to get your message out there to both scientific and non-scientific audiences, as well as that collaborative ability to work in and manage a transdisciplinary team. So I really recommend that you work on those skills while you have this amazing opportunity in GloCal, and you're mentored and you're working with big teams, and you bring that to the next generation as you continue to train and pay it forward. There's some recommendations here for students and early career professionals, and you have some recommendations for workers as well in your PDF. But I do think it's worth noting that you probably need to step out of your comfort zone and maybe reach across some disciplinary divides and develop new types of collaborations. There's some resources listed for you. And also, if you're interested, we do an intensive Summer Institute training program that brings together people from, I think in the last 3 years, we've had more than 22 countries represented in this small intensive field course. We conduct it with our colleagues at Sokoine University of Agriculture and Ifakara Health Institute as the leadership, and then many other collaborating organizations in Tanzania. And I've given you the dates here if you're interested. Okay, and now I'll turn it over to you for questions.
My name is Steven. I'm calling from, I'm in Uganda, and I read your CV. I was impressed how you have been able to build your research profile where you have won big grants. My question to you is, how have you been able to put together a transdisciplinary team for writing research grants, and how have you dealt with conflicts? And just a little note for you, I am an academic mentor and supervisor for One Health graduate fellows at Makerere University.
Fabulous.
So I know OShea office in Makerere, and I work with them closely.
Yeah, so OShea, for those who don't know, is the home, Makerere is the home of the OShea Secretariat that I mentioned, and is very, very much involved in leading the One Health workforce activities across Africa. We also collaborate with Makerere for the PREDICT project and our program Gorilla Doctors, where we work with the endangered mountain gorillas in Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC. So lots of linkages and partnerships with your amazing university. So, you know, it's wonderful to speak with you here, and it's wonderful to collaborate with your colleagues there. It's a great question. I would say for developing disciplinary sort of application process for big grants, you have to be committed to a lot of communication, and frankly, that's a huge amount of work. And so you just you have to sort of bite the bullet, I guess we say, and decide that you're up for the added benefits should you be successful by investing early on, excuse me, in the process that allows for that inclusion of different disciplines, getting to know each other, speaking kind of either the same language or being respectful that our disciplines aren't always speaking the same language, and culturally we may not speak the same language in practical language as well. So so that can slow down a process that we often think in academia, you know, we have to hurry in and make these things work on a really rapid pace, and so there are some big challenges there. One, I would say build your network before you know what funding is going to be available, because you believe that the problems you're interested in addressing are those that are important, and you will find the finding, so you will find the funding opportunities. So start to build your network early. Talk to people that you would like to collaborate with, get to know each other, start working on ideas even before there may be a call out for a specific grant. That way you're ready, you have a team, and when the grant calls come out that sometimes are sort of on short timelines, you already have a lot of that background work done, and you know each other, and you know strengths and weaknesses and how you can pull together as a team.
Thank you very much.
Clara, GloCal Fellow from Uganda. I wanted to ask a question specific to the work that you presented on discovery of different strains of viruses, like you mentioned, Ebola and Marburg. And I'm wondering if that is because of improved diagnostic techniques that we have, or is it because these viruses are evolving in the animal hosts? And if it is if it's a question of evolving or mutations, is there a way of predicting future mutations and using that to prevent future outbreaks?
Sure. So great question. Certainly there's a combination of things going on. One is our data are showing that there are many, many more spillover events than we ever thought before. So exposure to things like Ebola and Marburg are likely in areas where it's circulating and animals are shedding it much more common. And people, some people don't get sick. Frankly, some people get sick and recover on their own and don't infect their whole family or cause an epidemic. And then others certainly do start off an epidemic. So there are many things that we sort of accepted as dogma with some of these viruses, but we didn't study the viruses. So we didn't learn until now that they're simply more common and they aren't always as severe. It's that combination of environmental factors, epidemiologic factors that come together more rarely to cause more severe outbreaks. So there's a combination of, as you go look, we do find more, and when we find more, we can learn more and learn that what we believed may have been very incorrect, and that the things, that's actually kind of hopeful, because that means that there's more we can do and there's more survival potential. But occasionally we do get what we think of as a hot strain, or we get a particularly vulnerable population, and we see outbreaks take off and become regional regional epidemics or even pandemics. So the technology that we're using, there are certainly new technologies, are relatively new, less well-distributed technologies like next-gen sequencing that we can use. But we're with the PREDICT project, we were using old technology, frankly, conventional PCR, but using just conserved sequences of viral families to identify likely positive samples for viral families known to have caused disease in people and epidemics in people. And then we would go to full sequencing, but again, more traditional Sanger sequencing to identify the species and, if possible, the strains, but often to get to the strain level, we would have to do a full genome sequencing.
Thank you.
Maybe I could try ask another question. I saw in CV that you actually had a grant which was as small as 7,000 to 7, and you also had big grants.
Yeah.
So, how do you manage all these things happening at the same time? How do you keep juggling between academia, research, family, all this stuff?
Yeah, probably not very well, to be honest. I think, well, first of all, the ideas and the things that I'm interested in and the problems that I'm interested in sometimes have funders that are willing to put large dollars to, and sometimes don't. So sometimes we still, even though we have kind of these hundreds of $million grants, we have interests, or I work with graduate students that have interests that there are no funders for, or maybe only someone is willing to give you a small pilot grant. But I'll tell you, this work that I do now that has this huge dollars, when I started more than 20 years ago, there was no funding for it. There was no funding for One Health. Nobody would pay for what I do. and all my grants were less than $10,000. And so I'm very respectful of those tiny grants, and sometimes they're just as much work as the big ones, but I'm respectful of those because they seed the interest and the desire of our team. But then also, if we're successful and we write good papers and we put good information out into the community, they can develop into these much, much bigger and more powerful ideas where we can really build bigger teams. That said, the bigger the team, the bigger the money, the more complicated the collaborations and the commitment to communications that I mentioned before. I do have 2 daughters. They're grown now, but they were born and grew up from my graduate career until now. They're in their 20s. And it's always been a fine balance. And I've loved my career as well as being a family person and trying to have a rich life. But I will say that I never feel like I'm balancing everything all at once. I feel like sometimes I'm doing a much better job with the family and not as well at work. And sometimes I feel like I'm doing really well at work and not so well with the family. And the family tells me that's okay. It all balanced out over time. So having a great partner and support network has really helped as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Hi, Jonah. I am Lucia. I have a question regarding working with people from so many different countries. How do you deal with cultural barriers, language barriers, and just in general communication?
I don't know that there's a one magic potion for making that work. I think, again, as I mentioned before, being really committed to respect across all cultural and disciplinary differences, and making sure people are heard and have their time, and sort of building from a team perspective rather than, I'm the boss, you do this, you do that, you're good only at this one thing. Because as we come together, we do a lot of Zoom calling. We do a lot of, conference calling. It's really hard across disparate time zones as well. And then across language barriers is really tough. So we just have to have team members who are willing to be the ones that will translate for each other, and we just make it a really high priority. It's the hardest thing, I think, in One Health, is that commitment to communication, because frankly, you could write a smaller grant, you could go into your laboratory, you could do research on one small part of a problem or an enzyme or a mechanistic piece, and you could make a great academic career, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need folks doing that. But at some point, teams have to come together and really work together if we're going to solve the problems, because somebody has to integrate all that information, the basic science, the applied science that's happening in all of these different laboratories. At some point, those people have to commit to working together, because we've seen historically, in health especially, that we don't make great strides until the collaboration happens.
Thank you.
Clara, again, I just wanted to ask, in relation almost to what you've been talking about, what are the operational challenges that you would highlight in if one considered forming a multidisciplinary team, and how would you go about to minimize those kind of challenges that you foresee?
Operationally, I think the funding is the biggest piece. Is that if you are going to build a large transdisciplinary team, everybody needs to have the funding to do their own piece of the work, as well as the time, which costs money, to come together. So operationally, you really do, you need the money. And historically, throughout my career, there hasn't been, again, money for these large transdisciplinary pieces. And so a lot of times we would build teams, and each team member, there might be multiple PIs that get grants. We have amazing partners in human health that would write a grant, a smallish, if you will, $100,000 grant for the human health piece, but design it in such a way that it can integrate with the agricultural members of the team who are writing their own grant. And that would integrate with the people working on the environmental side. But we'd all have to be thinking and communicating ahead of time so that we could actually functionally do the work together, so that the data can be combined and aligned and analyzed together. I'm hoping that with these big projects that are now getting done, and with the momentum in One Health, that will be less of a problem for the next generation, that you will have the opportunities to apply for grants that actually fund the One Health piece directly, but it's not required. The other operational part is really around the disciplinary respect. And I think part of that is associated with the differential that we see with different sectors having access to more or less funding. So we may, in that last example that I mentioned, we may see, for example, the human health side having access to much larger dollars than the environmental health side. And so the environmental side would sort of end up having a much smaller role, and that doesn't fix the issues. So sometimes we have to commit to sharing some of the resources as appropriate and ethical with the funding sources. But that becomes, things can get really out of balance just based on the practical realities of how projects are scaled in the current climate. I don't know if that really answers your question, though.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I've just sent you a thank you email.
Oh,
and I was wondering about the contact details you shared. There is Jonah Mazet, and is it that a Twitter or a LinkedIn?
That one's Twitter. Yeah, I'm not a great tweeter, so I wouldn't. You can follow me if you want, and every once in a while I get active and then I drop off. So, but I'm not on LinkedIn. I think someone made a dummy page, so it might seem that I'm on LinkedIn, but I'm not on LinkedIn at all, and I'm only sort of on Twitter. I'm trying.
So you're on LinkedIn?
I am not on LinkedIn. It's best just to email.
Okay, all right. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I will say I hadn't been on any of the social media, probably because, as I mentioned, I was raising a family and doing all these projects, and social media felt like just more things for me to monitor and participate in every day, and more things for me to feel bad that I didn't get to at the end of the day. I joined Twitter because unfortunately, when you start to have big projects or big findings in this sort of realm of social media, I started to get people trolls, like saying really nasty things in the social media space. And some of it not less nasty, but still very critical, was around that piece where we were communicating to the public maybe prior to putting publications out. And so I did join Twitter just to try to have a little more positive influence. I don't engage in any kind of battles or bashing of people who bash me or anything like that, but just trying to encourage us all to support each other and be positive. We don't have to agree with each other, but we could be civil and support each other in those spaces.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Do we have any more questions?
Maybe I can ask one. I'm sorry, I've been over asking.
No, it's
That's
perfect.
okay.
Thank you.
I remember when I was at the NIH, I think one of the presentations somebody mentioned about finding one thing that you focus on in your research
Mhm.
career. And
Mhm.
yesterday, we met somebody from the African Population and Health Research Center, because currently I'm attending the conference on African Population Conference. And so we had a chat, and another person raises the same issue that within the first 3 years of your PhD, you need to focus on identifying one research area and do it so well that you stand out as an expert at the end of the day.
Mhm. Mhm.
I wanted to ask, is that something that you did sometime back, or what is your reflection about it?
Yeah, I have a couple of stories on that. First, I would just say that is the traditional advice, and there are lots and lots of reasons why that's great advice. And I think during your PhD and even your postdoc and early career, it is very good advice. You want to have, first of all, disciplinary strength, and you want to have some expertise that people can look at, understand what you've done, what you've been successful achieving, and want to bring you onto their team. So they need to be able to see that. So I do agree that there are good reasons to have very strong outcomes in a certain area. That said, when I was a brand new faculty member, just coming onto the faculty at UC Davis, my department chair said the same thing to me. You won't get tenure, you won't be successful if you don't become an expert in just one thing. And he suggested to me that one thing was sea otters. I should be I think he even used the words, the queen of sea otter science, because I had done my PhD looking at health impacts on sea otters, because I wanted to solve a conservation challenge for that species. At that time, I told him that my interests were to be in the problem-solving arena, and that I didn't want to just work on sea otters for the rest of my life. I wanted to help solve that problem of recovery of that endangered species. But once that problem was on its way to being over, I would like to be able to switch to a different problem, or maybe even do multiple problems at one time and expand my influence. So I didn't take that advice, I guess, that he gave me. And if I had taken that advice, I probably would have had a wonderful career and a good time, but I wouldn't be working on these problems that I think are so much more critical to society than a single species.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I think we can call it a day.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jonah. It was a very good talk.
Okay, you all have a great day, night, wherever you are.
Thank
Great,
you.
thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.